Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. These are series of lectures which are being brought to you by the Indian Institute of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. Our area or domain is cultural studies, and we have completed several lectures by now, and I hope you have been able to get a grasp of some of the key concepts and formulations under the general or broader rubric of cultural studies. Let us do a recap of the last lecture, which was entitled Ethnicity, Race and Nation. You will recall that ethnicity, race and nation were seen as forms of cultural identity, and we had said that ethnicity, race and nation are by no means terms that are used only in cultural studies. You know that these are also terms in sociology, political science, anthropology and even literature. But we also said that cultural studies exploration of terms and concepts like ethnicity, race and nation are looked at in a way that is different from the way these are looked at in domains such as sociology, political science, etc. Okay? We see these as cultural forms and forms that have to do with cultural identity. We also saw that as categories, these terms like ethnicity, race and nation are at once discursive, performative, identity constructing, shifting and unstable in the sense that their meanings, definitions, their connotations are never fixed, but take on different forms and meanings in different times. And finally, they are nodal points of identity and subjectivity. We looked at race as something, when looked at in cultural studies, is seen as not being outside of representation, okay, which is, again, let me reiterate, it is not to say that these are not realities or that they are not lived out in our real lives. However, the main point was that they are formed in and by symbolization. Okay? So, they are also matters of science and signifying practices. Then when we looked at nation, we found that nation and ethnicity are closely allied to nationalism, and that nation is a shared culture as far as race and ethnicity are also concerned. Again, nation is culturally formed by contingent historical circumstances, and a nation is a collective form of organization and identification. We also saw, importantly for purposes of cultural studies, that not only are nations political organizations, but also equally importantly, nations are cultural. Okay? Nations have to do with lived lives, they have to do with symbols and images, they are to do with discursive practices, with descriptions, definitions, with language, and finally with representation. And we could easily say that vis-a-vis other domains or subjects, this is this is what cultural studies is most concerned with as far as nation or even race and ethnicity are concerned. We also looked very briefly, we just mentioned an important book, Imagined Communities, by the well known scholar Benedict Anderson, and we made this differentiation. We said that the nation is an imagined community, right, whereas national identity is the narrative of shared origins, symbols and rituals. Fine. So, this was a brief recap of the last lecture, and we now move into lecture 7 in module 3. Module 3, as you know, is entitled Sites, and we have already been through several such sites of cultural studies. That is where all these the terms that we learned, the concepts that we learned in module 2 are applied, okay, and we are trying to see how culture happens in these sites. Okay. So, in this lecture, the site that we are going to look at is globalization. Well, of course, globalization is such a huge topic, and there are so many aspects to it, and surely within the very limited scope of a single lecture, we shall not be able to really unpack the term. Okay. However, I would like to bring to you at least some of the ways in which we can talk about globalization, particularly within a cultural studies framework. As always, let me declare the key source texts in this lecture, and the key source texts are Chris Barker's Cultural Studies Theory and Practice, and another very useful book, The Sage Handbook of Cultural Analysis, edited by Tony Bennett and John Fromm. Well, when we talk about globalization, it is generally held that there may be several positions taken by scholars not only in cultural studies, but also in kindred domains like sociology, anthropology, etc. And these three positions may be called A, hyperglobalization, B, transformationalism, and C, skepticism. Okay. So, it is really given in one order, as we shall see. Nevertheless, the three positions, as we said, are what? Hyperglobalization, transformationalism and skepticism. Now, let us look at these very briefly one by one. Hyperglobalization. Now, hyperglobalization is an is an attitude or even scholarly orientation towards globalization, okay, as a cultural, political, economic phenomenon. And this three sort of divisions have been made with respect to the degree, okay, with respect to the degree in which these orientations and the scholars belonging to these orientations look at the way globalization has happened or spread, or the way the extent, so to speak, okay, the extent to which globalization has been able to establish itself. So, hyperglobalization really is a term which is quite self-explanatory, as you will realize. The three ways in which we can describe hyperglobalization are A, the incessant march of globalization. It is looked at, we look at globalization under this particular orientation as something that is sort of that sort of extending all over the globe, okay, in which we can describe as an incessant march, which is going to, if not now, eventually catch up, okay, with all, or eventually is going to happen in all parts of the globe. Okay. So, we can also, if you look at the slide, call it a globalizing imperative. Now, you know the meaning of imperative, something that which you cannot do without, or something that is bound to happen, or that we are bound to accept. Okay. So, hyperglobalization sees that as if there is a globalizing imperative. Now, there are other terms related, that which are used with imperative. For instance, if in philosophy you will find the categorical imperative, okay, that is a without which not, so almost the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant. In technology, in studies of science and technology, you also have a term like technological imperative. Okay. So, if you can understand it along similar lines, there is a globalizing imperative under this understanding of globalization as hyperglobalization. And third, it implies the impending end of nation states. Okay. So, it is not just globalization, it is hyperglobalization, which is really revealed by words like these. Look at these words: incessant march of globalization, a globalizing imperative, and finally an impending end of nation states, right. So, we get the idea that scholars under this group will see or they look at consider globalization as something that is bound, so to speak, to happen. Now, let us look at the two other ways or orientations of scholars as far as globalization is concerned. The next, as you know, is transformationalism, and under transformationalism, again this word, like hyperglobalization, is quite self-explanatory in the sense that it looks at transformation, okay, of nation states. Here nation states irrevocably are affected or changed by globalization. So, it does not imply that all sort of nation states are sort of swallowed up by globalization, but there is an acceptance or there is an acknowledgement of the fact that nation states are undergoing transformation or they are changing because of the processes of globalization, and these changes are usually irrevocable. That is, the nation state does not go cannot retrace the steps that have been taken by it owing to globalization, but it also does not really signal what hyperglobalization calls the the impending doom, right, the impending doom of nation states. Okay. So, it suffice it for us to simply remember that there is an acknowledgement of the fact that because of globalization nation states are changing. Finally, again the third way or third orientation of looking at globalization is skepticism, right. Now, under scholars under this framework of skepticism are not ready to accept the fact that either that nation states are irrevocably changed by the globalizing process, nor are they certainly willing to accept that there is an incessant march of globalization, or that there is a globalizing imperative, so to speak, in today's world, as in the way that hyperglobalists would believe. Okay. So, anyway, these are the three ways, and when you read works on globalization, now that you know that there are these three ways of scholars looking at globalization, you should be able to place each critique or each scholar of globalization within one of these three different ways or orientations. Next, let us move on, and if Barker and other scholars agree that of all the processes that go into or that have gone into the globalizing process, or the processes that underlie globalization may be broadly clubbed under A, economics, B, internationalism, and C, information. Okay. So, they understand, or they say, they acknowledge the fact that economics, economic transaction, okay, economic flows is one very important process, if not the most important process underlying globalization, the spread, first the establishment and then the spread of globalization. Okay. Second, internationalism. By internationalism is meant not simply the not simply various nation states in the world interacting with one another, it also means the presence and the ever growing presence and importance and power of international bodies, for instance, the World Bank, okay, and various national companies that are spread out all over the world. Okay. So, internationalism is also another important process that underlies globalization, that has made globalization happen. And finally, not the least is information flows. Okay. Globalization has been able to happen, or it has become possible, so to speak, or it would not have been possible, so to speak, had there not been information flows on a global scale, on a huge scale, okay, especially the flow of electronic data, right. So what are the processes that underlie globalization? The processes are economic flows, internationalism, and information flows. Next, a very important term, right, again most of you are familiar with it, but when we talk about globalization from a cultural studies perspective, we need to look at neoliberalism. Okay? Please look at the slide. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism may be defined under four sort of processes. Okay? It is the liberalization of national markets, the opening up of national markets, okay, the removal of several, so to speak, the removal of several barriers, okay, to the flow of to the economic flows among nations. Okay. So, the liberalization or opening up of national markets, which is a part of neoliberalism, is extremely important, or is one of the processes that again makes globalization, at least contemporary globalization, possible. The second is the deregulation of capital flows, when you do not have very stringent laws or rules or norms regarding the flow of capital from especially across borders, okay, and where there are minimum trade restrictions, and there is one gives more rights to investors. Okay. So, I do not need to explain this in detail because that would again belong to another field, but just to open up, to unpack globalization to for this class, we may talk about neoliberalism as one of the pillars, so to speak, of globalization, where we have deregulation of capital flows and liberalization of national markets, more rights to investors, okay, and where trade restrictions are at a minimal, right. So, where finally now coming to culture, how do we look at culture, or what are the ways in which culture is looked, okay, are studied under the rubric of globalization. One of the first things to note here is culture. Please look at the slide. Culture here is an economic good. This is the most important point. Okay. So, culture is not separated here from economics. The cultural is also the economic, okay, and it is part and parcel of the economic flow, so much so that culture becomes a matter of market, of marketing. Culture becomes a good to be traded with other nations. Okay. So, one of the ways of looking at culture here is not simply as a way of life. Okay. So, we also here will look at forms of culture that are produced, that may be exchanged, that may be traded with with other nations. We looked at cultural products, okay, that are also marketed. So, this aspect of culture as an economic good, as a marketable good, is part of also of the study of globalization under a cultural studies framework. So, here what happens is, when we look at culture in terms of economic flows, we see certain similarities, right. So, let us look at this slide. This is very important for us. For instance, A, there would be no restrictions on cultural imports, right. Just look at, recall the slide on neoliberalism. Also the same thing is apparent here, okay. The minimizing of restrictions, right, the across borders, the flow not only of economic goods, or the flow not only of capital, okay, but also the flow of cultural imports with fewer restrictions than was seen, maybe a few years ago. Next point is that there is no, or at least minimal, protection of natural cultural forms. Okay. So, if there is if there is under globalization a readiness, okay, to market cultural forms, a readiness not to put restrictions on different cultural imports. Okay. So, in the same way there is minimal protection of national cultural forms. Third, there is a tendency to encourage global mergers and joint ventures as far as culture is concerned. Now, here by culture certainly we do not mean only the commonsensical use of the term cultural forms as dance, music, etc. These are also, for instance, education, right. The opening up of the education sector to parties beyond one's national boundaries. Okay. So, the encouragement or encouraging of global mergers and joint ventures as far as different cultural forms and institutions are concerned. Okay. And finally, no or very little cultural autonomy to nations, right. So, this really is the crux of understanding culture, the flow of culture under globalization. What are these? There are no or at least minimal restrictions on cultural imports. There is the encouraging of joint ventures of global mergers for different cultural forms, products and institutions like education, minimal or no protection of national cultural forms and minimal cultural autonomy to nations. Okay. So, you see, along with the flow of economics, along with the flow of information, along with internationalism, okay, cultural goods, forms and institutions are also sort of neoliberalized. They are also being opened up to whether for consumption or enjoyment or investment, right. These are also made readily available across national boundaries. Now, I referred, one of the key source texts is in this lecture, apart from Barker's book, is an essay by Diana Crane, which is in the which talks about culture and globalization, global flows. Okay. This essay is in the book Sage Handbook of Cultural Analysis, and let me now quote from Diana Crane's essay in that volume. The cultural equivalent, okay, let us underline this, the cultural equivalent of the neoliberal model of economic globalization. This is precisely what we had been talking about, that there is a parallel to economic liberalization. The parallel is found in this new concept of cultural neoliberalization. Okay. So, the cultural equivalent of the neoliberal model of economic globalization perceives globalization as a process that is producing globally transmitted cultures. Okay. Let us read this again. The cultural equivalent of the neoliberal model of economic globalization perceives globalization as a process that is producing globally transmitted cultures which emanate from a hegemonic center. This is important. Okay. These globally transmitted cultures, no matter where they come from, okay, no matter how diverse the nations or how how far they are even physically from from one another, what happens is they ultimately emanate from a new center of power, from a new hegemonic center. Now, let us read on, consisting of a few dominant nations. This is extremely important. Like this is also a form of cultural internationalism, if you like. Remember, we talked about economics, internationalism, and what was the other term? Information flows, right. So, what is happening here is, as Diana Crane asserts, that there is a new center of power, okay, which which causes the loss of cultural autonomy to nations, okay, because of deregularization or deregulation as far as cultural flow is concerned, okay. And a few dominant nations are now asserting their hegemony over the heterogeneous, the variety of, or the diverse cultural forms of so many nations which are not hegemonic. Okay. So, consisting of a few dominant nations, and which reduce, let us look at this slide please, which reduce the cultural autonomy of less powerful countries that constitute a weak periphery. Okay. So, this is a very important quotation, or a very important extract from Diana Crane, that there is the formation of a new cultural hegemonic center, okay, a new cultural internationalism. Therefore, if we were to characterize globalization, okay, not simply in terms of economics, but from a broader sort of speak cultural studies perspective, then we would say that this contemporary globalization is characterized, or the pillars, so to speak, are these. Let's look at this slide A. Okay. For such a globalized situation to happen, there has to be a world capitalist economy. Okay. The economy has to be one that is driven by capital, that is driven by the flow of capital across breaking national barriers, okay, which is a world capitalist economy. Second, there has to be an information system in a global scale, okay, so that information can be derived from almost all parts of the world, okay, and many nations can have access to information, right. Of course, when you look at these first two, the world capitalist economy, the global information system, there is of course the question of access to both capital and information, right, which is such a huge divide, right. So, the third is that there is a nation state system, all right. We are not like the global hyper globalists saying, or that the nation state has disappeared. Okay. The nation state system is there, but the nation states of different parts of the world are increasingly partaking, right, in the world capitalist economy, the global information system, and are are causing mergers, right, and are enabling mergers, global mergers to happen, which affect all cultural systems, which affect our way of living, our way of life, okay, and which affect all the cultural, or beginning to affect all the cultural institutions. Finally, a world military order. Okay. So, these are the four so to speak pillars on which contemporary globalization stands today, and which from the cultural studies perspective is important, because all of these have have led to the control and to a new hegemony of cultural forms, and a new sort of new center and the new periphery in terms of cultural capital, okay, or in terms of cultural flows, like economic flows. Therefore, what is affected here, right? Now, if we talk about culture as ways of life, what is affected, right, in all nations here are all nations' economy, technology, culture, politics, and identity. In that sense, we say that globalization has touched, okay, if not irrevocably changed, has touched all parts of our lives. Then let us read from here. Globalization, as one of the critics says, globalization is not just therefore not just an economic matter, but is concerned with concerned not simply with culture, but also with, again, one of the most important terms in cultural studies. Okay, it is concerned with issues of cultural meaning, right. While the values and meanings attached to place remain significant, we are increasingly involved in networks which extend far beyond our immediate physical locations, right. So, there seem to be therefore two levels at which meanings of culture happen. Okay. As this critic points here, as far as meanings attached or meanings which emanate from one's from matters relating to place, right, to location, while the values and meanings attached to place remain significant for us, the increasing reality is that we are involved in networks, in the exchange of electronic networks of data, right, which have no significance as far as place is concerned, as actual location is concerned, right, which extend far beyond our immediate physical locations. So, as far as meaning is concerned, or even as far as value, terms like value and significance are concerned, we find that things are happening at perhaps at two levels. One which is an international one, where there are no so to speak, where place is not an important variable, okay. And on the other hand, we have certain meanings that are attached to locations and places. So, there seems to be a dual, a dual level of existence as far as cultural meaning, values and signification are concerned. Fine. Now, another way of looking at globalization, now pointing to something else that than what we have been discussing, is globalization is seen also as a series of processes which question the very concept of bounded societies and cultures. Okay. This is in fact celebrated by many scholars, celebrated by many critics, celebrated by many people with a certain orientation towards globalization. Okay. Now, look at the slide here please. They see globalization as a series of welcome processes, okay, which question the very concept of bounded societies and cultures. Now, this you can relate to a very cliched term which is called the global village, and that all the world's a village, etc., and then there has to be constant and unregulated exchange of information, of education, of various cultural assets and resources, okay, apart from economics, okay, all over the world. So, these scholars look at globalization as questioning the very concept, or questioning the very need for different nations to or societies to be bounded, to be autonomous, and they look at it as the happy opening up, so to speak, of different cultures and their resources. So, this is the other way of looking at globalization, and the one that we that many scholars also share, okay, a different set of scholars really, is that, as you saw just a while ago, that the very opening up of these bounded societies and cultures, instead of that creating an equality, has only created a new hegemonic center of powerful nations, even as far as culture is concerned. Okay. So, there is again a weak periphery. Cultural resources, again as I said, however diverse, however heterogeneous, or coming from whichever part of the planet, whichever nation, is sort of appropriated, if you may use the word, is appropriated. These things are appropriated by this new cultural center, and this new cultural hegemonic center is interestingly, of course, also the center which has economic power, or power over economic resources. So, instead, as the other set of scholars, as they argue, instead of this creating a happy flow of culture, is really only adding to the adding to the inequalities that exist among nations. Okay. So, let us again look at what Barker has to say. Again, this is from his book Cultural Studies, Theory and Practice. Much of the vocabulary of social and cultural change, post-Fordism, post-industrial society, post-modernization, etc. Now, look at this, much of the vocabulary, that is the discourse, okay, of social and cultural change, contemporary social and cultural changes, this vocabulary or discourse has been absorbed into cultural studies. Okay. Further, cultural studies has tried to grasp these changes of these new societies or new arrangements, so to speak, try to grasp these changes at the level of culture. Now, this is again, as I have kept repeating over and over again, not simply to do with globalization, not simply to do with the topic of this lecture. Okay. I again would reiterate that many of you may feel that even the terms, the sites, even some of the scope of all these things that are being discussed in these lectures, in this virtual classes on cultural studies, it is not that these are not taken up by other domains, but as Barker says here, these are cultural studies has tried to grasp the changes at the level of culture. Okay, this is most important for us, at the level of culture, through what? By doing what? By exploring or through exploration of things like consumer culture. Okay, what happens owing to globalization? What are the orientations of consumers? What are the different consumer patterns that emerge? Okay, what is the power of play of power and politics even at the level of consumption, not only of distribution and production of goods. Okay. Then what is this global culture? What is this global culture that we are talking about? Who has a grasp or control over what is available, so to speak, in global culture, and to what we have access and to what we do not have access. Okay. These are again matters of cultural studies. Cultural imperialism, is there something like cultural imperialism when we have a new hegemonic center that has control over power resources? Is it then a fact that there is a new imperialism which is cultural in nature that we are facing? Matters of post-coloniality, of post-colonialism, how does then one right sort of answer, or how does one, as somebody put it, how does one write back to this new sort of cultural imperialism, right? What do we protect in our national cultures, and what is supposed to be a healthy internationalism? These are the matters. Okay, these are the matters that are taken up within a cultural studies framework. Fine. Therefore, it is interesting to see that globalization involves a certain paradox. Okay. It seems to involve a certain paradox as far as culture is concerned. And what are these? At one level, there is definitely a compression. Okay, the compression of when all the world, so to speak, is a global village. There is a compression with high accessibility because of internationalism, because of the flow of information. Okay, there is a certain compression of the world, right? Right. So, but even as there is a compression, definitely there is also an opening up, or there is also a widening. Right? There is also a widening because of the connections that have been made, because owing to the establishment and owing to the continuing processes, so to speak, of globalization. Right? For instance, there are huge connections that are important connections that are made among nations owing to economic flow of capital, owing to information. Okay. So, as even as we are more connected, even as we are sort of widening up, the important thing to realize also is that there is a compression of the world. So, this is a paradox that is part and parcel of the globalizing process, right. So, in the next slide we are going to look at, because in this entire course we will be also looking at from time and again I have been quoting from different critics, time and again I have try to bring you the formulations and articulations of important scholars in this field. Okay. One is of course, because cultural studies is all about articulation, it is all about discourses, it is all about describing and at the same time critiquing descriptions, right. It is all about discursive activities, right. So, it is very important, perhaps even compared to some other areas, other domains, this kind of looking at different articulations and formulations is extremely important in cultural studies, which where discourse plays a most important part. So, we are going to look at one such scholar whose formulations are very important as far as particularly as globalization is concerned, and his name is Arjun Appadurai, and we are going to look at his formulation or his concept of disjunctive flows. Okay. Disjunctive here, the word disjunctive means lacking connection. Okay. You may see these things happening, but there is a certain discreteness or autonomy to them. Okay. So, he talks about contemporary globalization as being characterized by certain flows. Okay, we have come across the term flows, remember we saw flows, we saw the importance of economic flows, of cultural flows, of international flows, right, in globalization. He gives us 5 terms here. Now, let us look at these. He says that their contemporary globalization is a series, or there are processes of flows, and he calls them ethnoscapes, technoscapes, financescapes, mediascapes and ideoscapes. Okay. Now, this is the flow of flow of various how should I put it, various aspects of life. For instance, maybe finance, it may be technology, right, it may be the flow of media, it may be the flow of ideologies, okay, and ethnicities, right. The important point to note here is that he calls these flows disjunctive flows, or he terms them flows that need not have any connection, that lack connections among themselves. Okay. Nevertheless, it is to be seen as a series of processes of flows. Then what happens is, because of this, right, let us look at this slide, because of this there are the metaphors that we see here, because of this disjunction. Okay. The metaphors that we find here are metaphors where there should have been easy accessibility, or there should have been so to speak, if there are so many connections, if there are so many flows, if there is so much of opening up, then there should have been a certainty about things, more easy accessibility to knowledge. But what happens is that that one kind of discourse about globalization, okay, and perhaps rightly so, has harped on the increasing presence of certain kinds of metaphors, okay, in the discourse. These are metaphors are those of uncertainty, okay, contingency, right, and chaos. This is very important. At the discursive level, okay, at the level of discourse, at the level of understanding, at the level of knowledge, it seems that uncertainty, contingency and chaos are increasingly replacing those of order, stability and systematicity. Okay. So, Appadurai points interestingly to the fact that all where some may erroneously see everything in terms of systematic flows of whether economy or of finance, of capital, or of culture, of cultural flows and information flows. Okay. Instead, of it being systematic, we find that there is chaos, disjunction, okay, lacking connection and order, right, and the discourse is full of metaphors of instability, of contingency, of things, of things that that seem to happen suddenly out of certain sort of a certain conglomeration of events, of haphazard or unconnected events, right. Happenings are contingent upon certain random events, right. So, order, stability and systematicity, right, in culture seems to have been replaced or are being replaced by instability, contingency and chaos. Now, let us read on. Globalization and global cultural flows cannot be understood, this is important, cannot be understood through neat sets of linear determinations. Okay? Rather, they are better comprehended as a series of overlapping, overdetermined, complex and chaotic conditions which at best, look at this word, cluster around key nodal points. Now, let us look at this very carefully. Okay? It is a fiction that therefore, it is a fiction that globalization is a sort of a forward march, right, of the constant or the increasing opening up of cultural markets, opening up of constant and more accessibility to things. Okay. On the other hand, these cultural flows are seen as overlapping, overdetermined and complex and chaotic. Overdetermination is a term, as some of you may know, but let me talk about it. Overdetermined, when are things overdetermined? This also comes from chaos theory. Things are said to be overdetermined when the set of causes that have led to a particular event is the causes are more than have been determined by us. Okay. So, or are more than those that have determined it. So, if you think that a particular set of causes has led to a certain event or has caused a certain event or phenomenon, okay, there are other causes that are hidden for whatever reason, that we are we are not in a situation in which our knowledge is not up to the mark that we can find out all the causes, right. So, when all causes are not comprehended or apprehended by us, then that phenomenon is said to be an overdetermined one. So, even not simply scientific phenomena, okay, cultural phenomena are also then overdetermined, and you find it is very difficult for us to completely analyze cultural flows in this, because they are random, they are often chaotic, they are overdetermined, and they are certainly not systematic and definitely not linear. Okay. So, you see how cultural flows also under globalization, okay, some critics have pointed to to a strong problematic here, right. So, it is problematized in the sense that we cannot see it as a linear march of globalization, or that there are neat reasons, or that there are neat sets of, as it says here, linear determinations of cultural flows. Okay. So, an important or a useful term here is hybridization, right. So, we now have a replacement of terms here. Okay. In the older discourse, we use terms like imperialism or cultural imperialism of one a set of nations, a few few nations having control in an imperialistic sort of way over cultural flows and of homogeneity. Today, we have these new terms, which is globalization and hybridization. Okay. So, in just we saw in the slide just before this that these are disjunctive, right. So, the point is they are hybrid, and one of the best ways is to describe them as hybrid, even if you cannot even if you cannot unpack the way this hybridization has happened, even if you accept the fact that there is overdetermination, the better word to use here is hybridization, owing to this easy flow of cultural information across nations, right. So, finally, this also means this also means questioning the whole concept of cultural imperialism, and let us read here. It is no longer the case, if it ever was, that the global flows of cultural discourses are constituted as one way traffic. It is never one way. Okay. It is not necessarily a form of domination, right. We do not have to see it as simply as it says here, one way traffic in which one set of nations dominates another set, and it is not clear that globalization is a simple process of homogenization. Okay? We cannot say that the world is becoming again homogenized, because the forces of fragmentation and hybridity are equally as strong. So, we see these forces that pull and push, so to speak, okay, even in the cultural domain, right. So, we cannot, we saw the paradox, as it were, of connections, increasing widening of flows, and at the same time a compression of the world. So, it seems in a globalized situation one has to acknowledge and then live in an understanding of things as not being completely saturated by power from one set of nations on another. We have to understand things as being overdetermined, as overlapped, as hybrid, where questions of power and imperialism are not so straightforwardly worked out. Fine. So, we will now look at a few questions that may come up in your in your exams, and let us see how best to answer these. If you get a question like, cite the three chief orientations of scholars towards globalization, then your answer would be this. The three positions that are usually occupied or adhered to by scholars are those of hyper globalization, of skepticism, and of transformationalism, and we found that in a hyper globalized in the situation or position of hyper globalization, what do scholars do? Then you have to say that scholars point to globalization as something that is imperative, something that is going to happen, and it also spells the end of nation states. Under transformationalism, you may say that the fact that nations are almost irrevocably affected by this new connectivity of these new connections is sort of accepted by scholars, but they are not ready to accept that there is an impending end or doom, so to speak, of the nation state. And finally, on the other extreme, we have the skeptics who hold onto the belief that the nation state is definitely there to stay, okay, and they are very skeptical about what others see as this whole march of globalization spreading to all corners, so to speak, of the world. Next, if you get a question like this, what are the processes underlying globalization? Then the processes, the three main processes underlying globalization are, you say, economics, internationalism, and information. Okay. Contemporary globalization, then you may say, is informed by the flow of capital, okay, by the increasing deregulation of capital flows from one nation into another. It is also under the underlying, another important underlying process is internationalism of international bodies, of global mergers, of multinational companies. Then information, the flow of information, the ready flow of electronic data. Okay. So, these are the processes that have enabled globalization to happen. Then what is the place of culture in the global order? The answer is, in the global order, when we talk about globalization, culture may be seen first as an economic good. Okay. The parallel here is between economics and culture. Okay. If there are capital flows, the easy capital flows underlying globalization, in culture, okay, like an economic good, there are also cultural flows where also there is a sort of neoliberalism as far as the flow of cultural goods and resources are concerned. There are increasingly minimal regulations as far as flow of cultural forms is concerned, products is concerned, and also that in that there is the enabling of global mergers as far as even cultural institutions like education is concerned. Okay, the investment in education across national borders. Okay, so one cultural form, education, and of course there are other cultural forms like media, etc., as we saw in the case of Arjun Appadurai's formulations. And then we say that globalization, however, okay, even if you call it an economic good, it is not completely so. Why? Because it has to do with issues of cultural meaning, it has important implications for our ways of life, it has important implications as far as what kinds of cultural forms are available to us, which determine the consumption of cultural forms. Then another question, what specifically does cultural studies study in globalization? Okay. And we saw that we may say that though globalization is a term that is interdisciplinary in nature, it lends itself definitely to economics, to sociology, to anthropology, to political science, even to literature. If we were to finally zoom in on what is studied in globalization, in cultural studies as far as globalization is concerned, then we will say after Chris Barker that it concerns the exploration of things like consumer culture, global culture, cultural imperialism, and post-coloniality. Or culture, that is a scholar in cultural studies is going to not going to study economic flows in globalization so much as he or she is going to study or going to explore the implications of globalization, of economic flows for consumer culture, for instance, for media culture, for instance. Okay, what it means, what are the meanings that new meanings, what are the new signifying practices or new significations that come up when we say that there is something called a global culture. What is cultural imperialism, problematizing the whole concept sometimes of cultural imperialism and insisting on hybridity, okay, saying that it is not a one-way traffic. Okay, the things are more hybrid, and power and the flow of power is more hybrid than is excuse me, is usually attested. And finally, how post-colonial nations try and protect perhaps or negotiate their own cultures. So, we come to the final question here, and this refers to the formulation by Arjun Appadurai. If you get a question which does not mention Appadurai, but says something like this: what are the disjunctive flows within globalization? Okay. So, the moment you look at the word disjunctive, then you understand that you have to answer this with the formulations given by Appadurai, and you say that according to the scholar Arjun Appadurai, globalization may or the contemporary situation is one that is informed by disjunctive flows, and that disjunctive flows are basically flows that do not have any any very apparent connection. They are discrete, and these are the different scapes that he calls these ethnoscapes, technoscapes, financescapes, mediascapes, and idioscapes. Now, not necessary that these have to show very very apparent or very obvious connections. These are disjunctive in nature. Fine. So, I hope this lecture was useful to you, and definitely there is so much else to talk about as far as globalization is concerned from various perspectives, but it was my what I wanted to do here basically was to show you some aspects of studying globalization within cultural studies, some of the formulations, some of the difficulties, okay, in level, some of the paradoxes that we have seen, okay, as far as talking about globalization within the cultural studies rubric is concerned. Okay. Thank you so much.